Let's move July 3rd, 2012. One of the most beloved men in American television history takes his last breath, and before his family even finishes crying, he is already in the ground. No funeral, no goodbye. No chance for anyone, not his fans, not the press, not even his own daughter to be there. Just 4 hours, from his last breath to 6 feet under, and for years nobody could explain it. Was the family hiding something? Was there a secret they didn't want the cameras to find? Why would the people closest to Andy Griffith rush his body into the ground so fast that his own child couldn't even get on a plane in time? Millions of people asked that question. The media asked that question. Even people who were there weren't talking. Until now, here is the real reason. And it is simpler and more powerful than most people expect. Years after Andy Griffith's death, author Daniel DeVise released a book called Andy and Dawn, The Making of a Friendship and a Classic American, and it finally shed full light on what really happened. According to DeVise, Griffith had trusted a small group of close friends with his plan long before he ever died. He asked them to make sure he was buried immediately after his death, before the paparazzi could storm Roanoke Island and capture his remains on film. That was it. That was the whole reason. Not a scandal, not a cover-up, not a dark family secret. A funeral spokesperson confirmed to reporters that the burial arrangements had been planned for some time and that it was simply the wish of the man himself. A man who had spent his entire life protecting his privacy made one final decision to protect it even in death. And everything that followed, every rushed hour, every grounded helicopter, every closed door was in service of that one quiet, deeply personal wish. How ironic that a man who was a symbol of wholesome American values was buried with no ceremony just hours after taking his last breath. But the family said it clearly and without apology. It was just the way he wanted it. To truly understand why he wanted it that way, though, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who Andy Griffith really was before the fame, before Mayberry, before any of it. Most people picture the same thing when they hear his name. A tall man in a sheriff's uniform, sitting on a porch, strumming a guitar, smiling that easy smile. They picture warmth, they picture simpler times. And that image was not fake. It was not a character invented by Hollywood writers. That was genuinely him. Andy Griffith was born on June 1st, 1926 in Mount Airy, North Carolina. A small town, a simple upbringing. His family didn't have much money. His father worked in a furniture factory. His mother cleaned houses. And Andy grew up surrounded by ordinary folks, full of quirks, full of heart, the same kind of people who would one day become the soul of his show. From a young age, Andy found his voice. He loved music. He loved performing. He would sing in church, in school, anywhere someone would listen. And people did listen. There was something about him that made you feel comfortable, like you had known him your whole life. He worked his way up the hard way. Community theater, small clubs, a comedy record that became a surprise hit. Then Broadway, then Hollywood came calling. But here is the thing about Andy Griffith that most people overlook. He never stopped being the boy from Mount Airy. Fame did not change his values. Money did not change his instincts. No matter how big his name got, he kept something that most Hollywood stars lose very early. He kept his privacy. And he guarded it like it was the most valuable thing he owned. In 1960, the Andy Griffith Show premiered on CBS. Nobody knew what they had. Not yet. Within a year, it was one of the most watched programs in America. Within 2 years, it was the most watched show on television. And by the time it ended in 1968, it had done something almost impossible for a television show. It made people feel good without making them feel like fools. There were no explosions, no scandals, no dramatic cliffhangers designed to spike your anxiety. It was just Mayberry, Sheriff Andy Taylor, his son Opie, Aunt Bee, and the incomparable Barney Fife, played by Don Knotts, Andy's real-life best friend. The show was gentle, but it was not weak. It was wise without being preachy, funny without being mean. In a world that was getting louder and faster every single year, Mayberry was a place where things made sense. Andy understood that deeply. He protected that feeling fiercely, and that quiet, stubborn desire to protect something pure. It would follow him all the way to the very end of his life. When the show ended, most people assumed Andy Griffith would fade away. He didn't. He evolved. He took on dramatic roles. He showed a side of himself that surprised audiences who only knew him as the wholesome Sheriff Taylor. He proved he was a real actor, not just a likable face. Then, in 1986, he came back to television with Matlock, playing a clever Southern defense attorney who always found the truth buried under the lies. The show ran for 9 seasons, and a whole new generation fell in love with him all over again. But here is the part of this story that nobody talks about enough. Behind all the success, behind all the smiles, Andy Griffith was quietly carrying a weight that most people never saw. He had battled Guillain-Barré syndrome, a serious nerve disorder that left him physically weakened for a long stretch of time. He had gone through failed marriages, and in 1996 he suffered the kind of loss no parent should ever have to face. His son, Andy Samuel Griffith Jr., died at just 38 years old. That loss changed something in him. People who knew him well said he became quieter after that, more reflective, more deliberate about what he gave his time and energy to. He still worked. He still laughed. But there was a new depth to him now. A man who had seen enough of life to know exactly what mattered and what simply didn't. By the time Andy Griffith reached his 80s, he had stepped almost completely away from the spotlight. He lived on Roanoke Island in North Carolina, back home, close to the land and the people he had always loved. He and his wife, Cindy, whom he had married in 1983, built a quiet life there. No big parties, no red carpets, no interviews for entertainment magazines, just home, just peace. His daughter, Dixie, later described those final years with great tenderness. She said her father had a deep spiritual faith that gave him genuine comfort. He was not afraid of dying. He had made his peace with God, with his life, with everything he had done and everything he hadn't. What he was focused on, what he had been quietly thinking about and carefully planning for years, was what would happen after he was gone. He had watched other celebrities die and seen the circus that always followed. The photographers crouched behind trees, the helicopters circling above grieving families, the crowds pushing for one glimpse of the coffin, the endless television specials and magazine covers dissecting a person's final moments. He had made up his mind a long time ago. He wanted none of it, not one single piece of it. And so long before July 3rd, 2012, he made his arrangements, quietly, carefully, the way he did most important things. He sat down with a small group of trusted local friends, people who loved him, not because he was famous, but because he was simply Andy. And he told them exactly what he wanted. He wanted to be buried immediately after his death. No waiting. No days of the body lying in a funeral home while the world found out and descended on Roanoke Island. He wanted to go into the ground on his own farm, on his own land, with people who genuinely cared about him standing nearby. No cameras, no crowds, no chaos. And then he did something that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He picked up the phone and called his daughter, Dixie. She later described that conversation in a way that is very hard to forget. She said it felt like he was passing something on to her, wisdom, love, something she was meant to carry forward long after he was gone. He told her he loved her. She told him she loved him. And she knew, somehow, that it was the last time they would ever speak. Andy Griffith died quietly in his sleep on the morning of July 3rd, 2012. He was 86 years old. He died at around 7 in the morning at his home in Dare County, North Carolina. By 11:30 that same morning, he was already in the ground, 4.5 hours. The plan went into motion almost immediately after he took his last breath. The small group of trusted friends gathered without hesitation. The arrangements made long in advance were carried out with quiet efficiency. There was no panic, no confusion, just a community of people honoring a man's final wishes with the same loyalty and care he had always shown them. And Dare County, the local community that had embraced Andy as one of their own for so many years, played its part without being asked twice. The county sheriff grounded all helicopters in the area. Not a single news camera was going to fly over that farm and capture Andy Griffith's burial on film. The locals formed an But there is one part of this story that carries real sadness, and it is important not to skip past it. Dixie, Andy's only surviving child, could not make it in time. Think about that for a moment. The very plan that Andy had so carefully put in place to protect his dignity. That same plan meant his own daughter did not get to stand at his graveside and say goodbye. She later spoke about it honestly and without bitterness. She understood her father's wishes completely. She respected them. But she also grieved the fact that by the time she could have gathered her children, gotten to an airport, and flown across the country to North Carolina, it was already finished. She later said simply, he didn't want a funeral, he didn't want a circus, he didn't want a media frenzy. She carried those words not as a complaint, but as a final gift from her father. A man telling his daughter, even at the very end, exactly who he was and what he believed in. There are no villains in this story. Just the messy, imperfect, deeply human reality of a man determined to leave this world on his own terms. When the news broke that Andy Griffith had died and was already buried, the reaction across America was disbelief. People felt something had been taken from them. They wanted a service, a gathering, a place to bring their grief. That is natural. That is completely human. But as the full story came out, as people learned this had been his deliberate, long-planned, deeply personal decision, something shifted across the country. People began to understand. This was not Andy Griffith being cold or secretive or strange. This was Andy Griffith being exactly who he had always been. A man who never wanted the spotlight for its own sake. A man who gave everything to his work and to the characters he brought to life, and then quietly, humbly asked for nothing in return. Not even a funeral. Ron Howard, who grew up on set playing Opie and remained one of Andy's closest friends until the very end, reflected on his passing with deep and genuine affection. He spoke about a man who was generous, grounded, and truly kind. Not the performance of kindness you see from many famous people. The real thing. The quiet, everyday kind. There is a version of this story that sounds strange. A man buried in 4 hours? No funeral? No chance for the world to say goodbye? But when you know the whole story, it sounds like something else entirely. It sounds like integrity. It sounds like a man who spent his entire career building a world, Mayberry, on the values of simplicity, honesty, and community. And then at the very end, he lived those values one final time. He didn't want cameras. He didn't want strangers weeping over a casket for the benefit of a television audience. He wanted his farm. He wanted the people who actually knew him. He wanted to go home quietly, the same way he had always tried to live, with humility, with grace. Andy Griffith gave America decades of warmth. He gave us Mayberry. He gave us Sheriff Taylor and Matlock, and that easy, gentle smile that made you feel like everything was going to be okay. And at the very end, he gave us one final lesson. How you leave says everything about who you truly are. He left with dignity. He left on his own terms. And if this story moved you the way it moves everyone who hears it, share it with someone who grew up watching him, because some stories deserve to keep being told.